We got a problem.
Can you hear me, Rob?
We got Peter Andy up there and Storm is getting...
You've got to get moving.
Antarctica is supposed to be science, silence, and nothing to fear but the cold. So why did a covert Navy SEAL recon come back with footage they will not describe on record and headaches they cannot explain? And why do certain basins suddenly get new rules no one wants to read aloud? When folklore lines up with restricted coordinates and a subglacial lake, that is not coincidence. That is a boundary. Are we guarding Antarctica for peace, or because something beneath the ice prefers to be left alone? Why Antarctica is off limits has more than one answer. The treaty paints a clean picture of Antarctica, a continent reserved for peaceful research where flags behave, guns stay home, and science shares its notes. Yet anyone who has spent a season on the ice knows the story is colder and more layered than the brochure. The weather is a ruthless gatekeeper. The distances are illusions that swallow judgment, and the logistics that bring a crate of batteries to the right hut at the right hour would humble a general. Add the Southern Ocean's illegal fleets that test the edges of enforcement. Add research stations holding data others would pay dearly to preview. Add comms nodes and under-ice sensors a rival would love to map. And the idea of no military activity starts to look like a matter of phrasing rather than absolute reality. Quiet professionals show up where polite language meets real risk. That is why a SEAL team was tasked with a reconnaissance loop that looked simple on paper and heavy in the air, confirm sensor health along a string of coordinates, verify no unauthorized activity near a line that did not appear on tourist maps, provide discreet overwatch for a civilian project with a name so plain it felt like camouflage. The rules were strict: gather data, avoid entanglements. If you encounter unknowns, you are authorized to leave, not to win. It sounded clean in the briefing room. It felt different when radios began to flicker like bored fireflies and batteries died faster than the cold could account for, which forces a simple question. If Antarctica is off limits for treaties and safety, what else on that map is off limits because certainty itself is not welcome? A mission that kept adding new rules. The route crossed wind-glazed flats into a basin that seemed unremarkable from orbit and unsettling in person. A quiet so deep it felt like pressure. A horizon that refused to hold still. And an ice skin over scattered melt ponds that behaved like thin glass with a will. The team worked in pairs, one on the horizon and one on the screens, while a compact ROV slid under refrozen water to read a grayscale world of shadows. And between the expected returns appeared a form that did not belong to any library the operator trusted. It was not a seal, not a whale rolling, not an iceberg shouldering over. It was simply smooth where nature is usually jagged, deliberate where random should reign, and too patient to be debris. They withdrew because repetition is the only way to separate apparition from data, and when they returned at a different hour with a different angle, the shape returned as well, an elongated mass beneath thin ice that held position without drift and registered just above ambient on a thermal rig as if it made heat of its own. The ice popped like knuckles and the radios cut a word in half. The team lead shortened every exposure, no lingering, no perfect shot, data then distance, because whoever wrote the original rules had not stood here with the sensation that the landscape was listening back. Orders did not change, but the rhythm did, which invites an uneasy thought. If the mission plan assumed only human threats and mechanical failures, what is the rule book for a presence that looks at you and decides you are not yet worth the trouble? The thing under the ice has a name. It shouldn't. The second sighting scraped away every comforting explanation. A lake surface went glassy, then stilled, and beneath it hovered a pale bulk larger than a truck, with contours that suggested limbs, if you allowed your eyes to admit that thought. Its head bulged like a beluga, sculpted by a stranger. Its face was barely a face. A broad slit where a mouth might be, and two eyes set lower than your reflex expects. And the worst part was the composure. A regard without malice or hurry, as if the observer was the subject. No one shouted. No one raised a weapon. There was nothing to fight, except the habit of believing the world is fully mapped. The ROV camera whined as it tilted, and the feed showed skin that did not simply reflect light, but seemed to manage it. A dim modulation that made the operator blink against a headache blooming behind his eyes. A low-gain sweep caught turbulence, but no body. The thing had gone deeper without commotion. And back at shelter, someone said the word that should not enter a report. Ningen, the name that creeps through cold water folklore like a rumor that refuses to drown. The word stayed in the room and off the forms, because professionals submit coordinates and voltages, not legends. Yet words have weight when they bind distant reports into a pattern, which leaves you with a choice. Do you call it myth, or do you ask why your footage looks like something strangers described before you were deployed? When folklore watches your monitor, Japanese crews told their stories in the 90s, under moonlight, where white water lies like glass and engines thrum in the ribs. A massive pale thing surfacing with a silhouette that tempts you to call it human before details betray that hope. A head too smooth, limbs too long, motion too deliberate, and eyes that regard you the way the horizon does, without expression and without mercy. Skeptics did what they should. They chased hoaxes. They found manipulated images and misidentified whales. They measured how a ray can look like a strange geometry at the wrong angle, and they catalogued everything that was not a creature so the remainder would be smaller. Yet the remainder refused to vanish. Independent accounts stitched together their own credibility, fishermen with no need for fame, researchers who prefer boredom to mockery, crew whose vocabulary for whales and ice is better than yours, all describing something that prefers night, appears slow when observed, and is gone when approached, and wears a milky color like a trick. The lengths vary wildly because distance in dark water lies. The outline repeats because biology likes what works, and the one constant is a feeling that you are being studied the way you study a chart. The SEALs replayed their video and paused on the shimmer that punished attention, and you could see it on their faces. Not fear of a monster, fear of a pattern, because if people on different oceans are telling the same story across decades, are they trading superstition, or are they independently describing something real that lives between our categories? Unexplored is not a metaphor down here. It is easy to say the ocean is mostly unexplored, and then treat that sentence like poetry. But the number is not a flourish. The majority of the seafloor has never been mapped at resolution useful to anything but trivia, let alone studied in the way we study soil, we plan to farm, or airspace we plan to cross. The sea is a stack of worlds with its own pressures, chemistries, and rules. And the Antarctic stack hides entire lakes under ice sheets that melt at their own underside. Dark reservoirs sealed from sky and storm for geologic time, which is long enough for evolution to make something beautiful and rude. Access is ruinously expensive. Windows are narrow. Visibility is treacherous. And the engineers who coax machines to behave at depth have more in common with magicians than they admit. This gap in knowledge is not simply academic. It is a permission slip for the unexpected. Life will build what the environment rewards, and the Southern Ocean rewards patience, camouflage, and indifference to cold, while subglacial lakes reward any strategy that turns darkness and pressure into advantage. If something wears a humanoid outline under the ice, that says more about our habit of seeing ourselves than it does about ancestry. The team knew these facts in training. They felt them differently while watching their own gear report a presence their manuals did not predict, and a thought began to surface with the consistency of a tide. If most of this world is blank in our books, who are we to declare what cannot be found where we have barely looked? A diver's story that echoes too much. Back at a larger station during a resupply, a civilian with deep experience in saturation diving shared a story the way people share something precious and unwelcome, not because he wanted to be believed, but because not telling it had become another kind of weight. The job had been routine, an oil rig maintenance cycle with visibility so poor your world was a cone of lamplight and a tether back to air you trusted. until an invisible weight pressed against his back as if the water had grown hands, and he turned into empty gloom that should have calmed him and did not. Then a shape slid in, not fast and not theatrical, squid-like because language needs a draw for terror, and its surface altered color in slow, deliberate waves that made his eyes want to follow and his limbs refuse to move. He remained conscious and trapped, aware and unable, and when the distance narrowed to a span where size could become a number, the colors dimmed and the paralysis dissolved, like a dial turned down by someone who understood the setting better than he ever will. The headache that followed ruined a week. The fear of water that followed surprised a man who had spent a life proving he did not scare easily. And there were no corroborating witnesses because rigs are mazes, and sightlines are stingy. He had tried to match what he saw to a catalogue and found no comfortable fit. Smaller squids explain nothing, normal predators explain less. And the only word he could choose without lying was influence. If a rig diver far from polar ice and a recon team beneath a southern sky are telling parallel stories, are we looking at cousins from a family tree we have not drawn yet? Lake Vostok and a silence that lasted too long. Antarctica hides water in the last place a textbook-trained mind will look first, under ice compressed enough to melt its own underside into lakes sealed from storm and sunlight. And the largest of these is Lake Vostok, a world within a world. Russian teams drilled toward it for years, drawing criticism for the lubricants chosen and the ecological risks accepted, while the Antarctic treaty partners balanced outrage with reality, since everyone wanted the knowledge and no one wanted the blame. Public plans and public updates marched forward. Then, at the moment when a breach should have been confirmed, the radios went quiet longer than weather alone could excuse. The summer window was closing, and worry grew like frost on glass. When the acknowledgement finally came, it was concise, success, and then the story did not unfold into the celebration science loves. It contracted into rumor, departures, and a letter no one could authenticate that credited Organism 46B with abilities that sound implausible until you remember what smaller cousins already do in friendlier seas. It spoke of color tricks that softened a mind, of bodies that flow through openings too small, of toxin delivered into water rather than flesh, and of a mimicry that chills because it is too precise. The borehole diagrams published earlier list diameters that would exclude human divers and welcome something boneless and clever, which is either a cruel coincidence or a practical detail in a tale someone wanted dismissed. The reasonable mind says, hoax. The reasonable mind also notices patterns, and the ugliest pattern is silence where noise should be. Because when a lake sealed for ages meets a drill, you expect graphs and samples, not a radio gap with a timeline that invites questions. So how many details do you need before a story moves from campfire to contingency plan? Monsters, explained just enough to be scarier. You can laugh at words like telepathy and hypnosis until you trace them back to biology we already understand. And then, the laughter turns into careful thinking. Start with electroreception, a sense that reads the faint electrical fields generated by muscle and nerve in every living thing. A sense sharks and rays use with brutal effectiveness in conductive seawater. And imagine it specialized for permanent darkness beneath miles of ice, where light is useless and electricity is a loud confession. Add camouflage that is not merely color matching, but active modulation through pigment cells and reflective plates that cephalopods operate with artistry. Add bioluminescence tuned to confuse and attract in black water, and what sounded like magic begins to look like a predator's vocabulary. Shape-shifting is a dramatic phrase for an octopus moving through an opening the size of a coin because it has no bones to argue with reality. Toxins are not exotic when a blue ringed octopus the size of a golf ball carries venom that would humble a nightmare. And intelligence is not a garnish when octopuses solve puzzles, pick locks, recognize faces, and plan escapes. Scale any of those traits into an ecosystem that has been training them for longer than human cities have existed. and the idea of a large, pale hunter that manages attention, confuses senses, and refuses photographs does not stretch science, it stretches our comfort. None of this proves a legend. It removes the need for fantasy to explain a creature that does things we are not ready to see at the wrong size in the wrong place, which leads to the question professionals never enjoy hearing on camera. If the ocean already built the pieces, why is it so hard to believe it assembled a version we have not named yet in a lake where we barely knocked on the door? The military answer. No one says out loud. Ask a uniformed planner about off-limits in Antarctica, and you will get the polite list first: safety, logistics, treaty compliance, environmental duty, and all of that is true in the boring, essential way. A safety briefing is true, but press any farther, and you will hear a phrase that covers more ground than a map: unknowns. Unknowns are not alien craft. They are behaviors, objects, and presences that do not fit the current checklist, and risk officers do not like checklists with blank lines. Critical research needs quiet. Foreign eyes need deterring. Infrastructure built for weather can collect signals worth protecting. A presence on the ice is still a presence in diplomacy. None of that requires monsters. Yet there is a second layer, the layer where a team sees something it cannot classify and returns with footage that does not go on public servers, where a basin is added to a list of places you do not loiter without permission, and where a commander chooses the least dramatic truth because drama increases traffic. The choice is not always sinister. Sometimes it is simply a grown-up reading of what the environment can do. Because if an unknown lives under thin ice and reacts in ways that leave people dizzy, the responsible order is not to announce a mystery. It is to reduce contact. The SEAL team filed what they had. The headaches went to a medic, the gear went to analysis, the rumors went where rumors always go, and the map acquired quiet edits that a tourist will never see. So when you hear that Antarctica is off limits for peace, is that the whole sentence, or is it the part of the sentence we can say on a microphone? If it is real, what changes first? Confirmation would not arrive as a cinematic reveal, it would arrive as protocols, a new caution zone around basins where thin ice overlays deep voids, new guidance for exposure, times when optical gear induces headaches, and quiet upgrades to drones and ROVs that carry sensors tuned to electrical fields and low-frequency pressure waves rather than just pretty cameras. It would show up in briefings that tell teams to avoid loitering over certain coordinates without admitting why, in memoranda that remind civilian groups to log unusual animal behavior with care, and in procurement lists that suddenly want more shielding, more redundancy, and more power conditioning. Science would adapt in a different key, expanding under ice mapping with instruments that can see voids and channels without disturbing them, building international frameworks for sealed ecosystems that treat them like living archives rather than loot, and training field teams to recognize cognitive effects the environment might inflict so they can back away before pride becomes injury. Public communication would lag on purpose, not because a cabal controls the truth, but because verification is slower than excitement, and the people most qualified to tell the story are the least inclined to speak before they know. The hardest change is cultural, admitting that a place we wrote off as sterile is busy with strategies we did not imagine, admitting that folklore might be a preprint that waited too long for peer review, and admitting that our maps have quiet edits that exist for reasons beyond diplomacy, which leaves one last practical question. If we prove there is intelligence under the ice, are we the ones who should be off limits? The boundary that teaches, more than it hides. Antarctica looks empty from a distance and crowded up close, crowded with wind that carves, with ice that thinks like an engineer, with oceans that smuggle life under every rule we thought we wrote, and with stories that insist we have been listening to the wrong voices. The SEAL team did not bring home a captured creature or a perfect image that silences arguments. They brought home a change in posture, shorter exposures, stricter routes, tighter comms, and the understanding that the map has places where curiosity should arrive with humility rather than conquest. Maybe the real meaning of off-limits is not power guarding secrets. It is wisdom guarding stability in a place that punishes casual visitors. And maybe the truth is not that humans are being kept away from important things, but that important things have endured because humans did not know how to interrupt them. The folklore people call Ningen could be a myth made stubborn by repetition. It could be a new neighbor that prefers the night. It could be a cousin of creatures we already respect, scaled to a world that did not invite spectators. And whatever the answer proves to be, the lesson remains the same. When a continent built of silence gives you a boundary, you do not break it for clout. You study it for meaning, and you ask the quiet question professionals ask each other in rooms with no cameras. If there is something beneath the ice that watches us watching it, are we finally ready to learn without needing to own? If this made you rethink why Antarctica stays quiet, hit like and share it with someone who still thinks it is just ice and treaties. Subscribe for more deep dives into places we are not supposed to understand yet. What do you think the team saw under that ice? Misidentification or something we have not named? Drop your take below.